Graham, what an amazing background you have. What an amazing career. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me, Linda.
It's great to have you tonight. You wrote a piece for Canada's National Observer on May 4th in the middle of the pandemic when we were all sheltering in place, entitled, "Canada Should Copy President Roosevelt and Create a Nature Corps." Can you tell us more about what you had in mind for calling for a Nature Corps?
Yeah, as you mentioned, I lived in the United States for a number of years. My wife is from New Orleans, and we've done a fair amount of hiking in the United States. And as you move around the national park system and the state park system, you often hear about this civilian conservation corps that was created during the 1930s. So I've always been fascinated by this particular initiative, government initiative. And when the COVID crisis hit, and it became immediately apparent that we were facing an economic crisis of truly unprecedented proportions in terms of the amount of economic disruption that was occurring in such a short amount of time. It brought back memories of the Civilian Conservation Corps for me, because at the heart of it, in the early 1930s, really during the depth of the Great Depression, United States President Franklin D. Roosevelt wrote to Congress and said, "I want to create a Civilian Conservation Corps." And at its heart, what this was a US president asking to make massive investments in nature conservation in the midst of one of the biggest economic crises in American history. And it became essentially one of the most popular programs within the suite of New Deal programs that US President Roosevelt and were rolled out during the Great Depression. They created 3 million jobs. They restored 4,000 campgrounds and historic sites and other important places in the park system. And they planted 2 billion trees, and they created 800 new state parks within the context of the Great Depression. And it just reminded me that when you have good visionary leadership, you can identify clear challenges and address them within the context of also advancing other priorities, and how investments in nature can be absolutely essential to an effective economic recovery.
You mentioned that this was predicated on having a really good leadership.
Yeah.
All of that came out of good leadership. Do you think Canada has good leadership now?
Well, I think, to be fair, it remains to be seen. We've had the Prime Minister step up and say, just because we're in a health crisis doesn't mean we're not in an environmental crisis. Very positive sign. We've seen the Prime Minister, within the context of some of the loan programs that were created, insist that there be more transparency among the large corporations that might benefit from these loans in terms of their climate risk accounting. We have some bold promises on the nature front from the federal government that have been reiterated in recent weeks and have not been lost by the broader, within the context of the broader set of circumstances we're currently struggling through. So I see no evidence yet that the environmental and nature commitments that this government has made will be abandoned. But at the same time, we're still waiting to see, as we move beyond the most acute phase of the COVID health crisis, whether or not the longer term stimulus investments, and longer term isn't all that long in the current context, are going to be consistent with some of the environment and climate and nature objectives that this government has stated. And I'm hopeful, but I think right now it's still a commitment that we're hearing rhetorically, and we're waiting to see what it looks like in practice.
Thank you, Graham. I have another follow-up question for you on that. But before I ask that, I wanted to mention something I forgot to say in my introduction, which is that all of you on this call, there's a Q&A box down at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we really invite you to ask questions. During the second half, I'll ask Graham some of your questions. And there's also a chat box, which is there for you to talk to each other, and we'll be putting in relevant links as we have this discussion that you might want to follow up on and read. So Graham, You mentioned green stimulus, and really that's what we're here to talk about tonight. What are, what to you would be the dream green stimulus package? What components would it have in it?
So, I mean, I think the two core dimensions of a green stimulus package would largely revolve around a set of climate change, clean energy investments and a set of nature investments. We know that there is an urgent need to accelerate the transition towards clean energy. And there are a lot of opportunities within that context um, related to the electrification of vehicles and the
Mhm.
establishment of new charging stations and a variety of different kinds of home renovations and other kinds of investments in improving energy efficiency that can put people to work immediately and that can also be part of a more medium term investment strategy. And then on the other hand, there are a variety of nature-related investments that have to do with the restoration of ecosystems, the planting of trees, the restoration of wetlands, assistance to farmers to improve cultivation practices and improve soil conservation and carbon sequestration, the establishment of buffer zones on creeks and rivers around farms, and a variety of investments related to removal of invasive species. And when I say restoration, I also mean large-scale restoration of areas of the country where you may have massive logging scars or the need for after mining restoration and reclamation. And so there's a variety of immediate shovel-ready investments that can be made that could help create and stimulate the kinds of jobs that we need. Within that context, you also need a clear justice framework. You need to be thinking clearly about how you help with the just transition, how you're investing in employment training, how you're making hiring decisions that are drawing from the diversity of Canada's communities, and making sure that you are consciously creating job opportunities in communities across the country. And you need to be thinking clearly about reconciliation as well. And in many ways, Indigenous-led conservation is the future of nature conservation in Canada. And there are a lot of very specific kinds of investments that can be made to support Indigenous-led conservation that would also help with the recovery. And then there's a set of additional investments that really need to be made to ensure that we're going to be able to meet some of the more medium-term goals that we've set for ourselves over 5 and 10 years, including major investments in expansion of protected areas and the maintenance of the park system, and variety of different kinds of investments in making sure that our park system continues to thrive and provide robust ecosystems and recreational opportunities.
That was quite a comprehensive list. It sounds like something you've given quite a lot of thought to, which is really good for Canada. And on that note, I wanted to ask you, what role will Nature Canada play in making all that happen? Like, how does a group like yours interface with the government and your
Yeah,
members?
I mean, at a federal level, when it comes to nature goals, the things that we are most interested in the broader sense outside of the economic recovery, relate to the expansion of protected areas and the very ambitious objectives the government has set, the restoration of degraded ecosystems, and nature-based climate solutions, which sit at the intersection of the twin crises of species collapse and climate change, and then also stronger environmental laws. And then as an organization, in terms of our supporter base, we're also very interested in helping people connect with nature, because the physical and health benefits of nature are clear and in many ways never more important than within the context of the COVID health crisis. So Nature Canada will be doing a variety of things. We will be engaging the federal government directly to ensure that, or to encourage the federal government and champions within the government and parliament to keep nature front and center in their minds as they move to plot an economic recovery, and to do so within a way that does accelerate and respond to the need for job creation and a broader social recovery process. We'll be working with organizations across the country. And as you said earlier, we have about 800 local nature groups that we interact with to some degree across the country, and we'll be working with them on talking about how their goals and our goals intersect with the green recovery, and how they can be engaging their supporters and decision makers, so that not only are decision makers at all level of government hearing about the importance of this, but also there's action on the ground, so we have a bottom-up movement happening. And then Nature Canada has about 100,000 supporters that we're in regular contact with, and another 100,000 followers on social media. And we're going to be engaged in a constant conversation with them about how the green economy is unfolding around the world, or the green recovery is unfolding around the world and in Canada, and things that they can do at the household, the community, the municipal, the provincial, and the federal level to make sure that their decision makers know that there are millions of Canadians across the country that care about the way in which our recovery occurs and want Canada to not just build back, but build back better.
And are there millions of Canadians across Canada that are on your side, that want to see a green economy? They want to see the recovery that way, that direction?
Yeah, there's no question in my mind that a lot of Canadians, well, millions of Canadians, not only, gain a lot of personal value from a psychological and mental and physical health perspective from their integration in nature, and have a real emotional attachment to nature as a result of that. Um, but also that part of the Canadian identity in their mind, rightly or wrongly, is really that we are a wilderness country, or a country of nature.
More
Um,
than that we are an oil country.
well, it's a bit of a competition, right? I would certainly say that most Canadians would think of Canada as a country of nature before they would think of Canada as an oil country. But at the same time, it does depend where you live. I mean, at the end of the day, Canada has 20% of the world's fresh water. We've got 24% of the world's wetlands. We've got 25% of the world's moist temperate rainforests. We've got over 30% of the world's boreal forest. And we have by far the longest coastline on the planet. And that is ingrained within the context of the Canadian mentality and nature. Often, sometimes in the wrong way, in the sense that we think there's so much nature that there's nothing we can do to harm it, which all evidence suggests is incorrect. But there's no question that there's also a deep affiliation with nature in Canada, and that Canadians want to see action to protect the nature that we love, because quite frankly, there's a lot of nature across Canada that is in serious trouble and needs support.
That is a phenomenal overview of Canada and what we are, our resources. Can you talk about, like, in your view, what is the state of Canadian wildlife right now? How's the wildlife doing?
Yeah, I mean, I spoke earlier about the twin crisis of climate change and species collapse or extinction, which is really, I think, they're the two defining environmental challenges of this period. And they relate to and feed each other, and we can respond to them simultaneously. Globally, over half of the world's population of fish, birds, and mammals have disappeared over the past 50 years. That includes about 40% of insect species, which are in decline. And according to the most recent overview and detailed exhaustive study by the United Nations, there are as many as 1 million species in the world that are projected to gravitate towards extinction in a business as usual scenario. So we are very much on the brink globally of the sixth mass extinction. the last one, which was the one that wiped out the dinosaurs. And this is, I think there's a growing awareness about this around the world as people begin to talk about the Anthropocene. In Canada, this is very much playing out as well. About half of the monitored species in Canada are in decline. And among that half, they're declining they've declined by an amazing 82% over the past 50 years. We have 3 billion less birds in North America than we did 50 years ago. So we are witnessing quite serious wildlife decline. And in many cases, people talk about extinction. But in Canada, what often happens is a species collapses to the point where it becomes a very small population, and then we invest a huge amount of money in keeping a very small population alive. Like the Calgary Zoo and some of their efforts have more sage grouse in captivity than are in the wild. So I characterize it as a die-off or a species collapse because it's not really a question of whether the species necessarily disappears. It's an entire range of species. Their populations are plunging in a phenomenal way. But there's also evidence that with the right support, many species can bounce back. You know, Canada geese were once an endangered species, if you can believe it. In southern Ontario, the wild turkey had to be reintroduced. And now you see them wandering through farms on a regular basis. So species can bounce back, but we just need to make room for nature.
On that note, what do Canadians need to know that they don't really know, that we don't really know about wildlife protection?
Well, I think it's important that people know that there's basically two essential challenges. One challenge is that we need to put aside enough nature. We need to basically share Canada with nature. And that means there is nature needs half. We need to make sure that we are providing some kind of protection to at least half of the country for the purpose of creating the space for nature to thrive. We also have a different kind of challenge in the south of the country, though, because essentially human habitation has already led to a serious crisis in terms of wildlife. And the challenge there isn't so much to just protect the best and most pristine places that are left. The challenge there is very much to begin to restore nature. We have to not just reduce the rate at which nature is being degraded, we have to launch an initiative to move us in the exact opposite direction and begin to restore nature. And it's really a very simple concept, right? It's basically the same notion as if greenhouse gas emissions are rising, we need to turn them around and they need to fall. We need a strategy not to slow the rate of increase. We need a strategy to actually reverse the direction we're headed. And we don't really have a strong vision for nature restoration in those areas that have already been severely degraded. We do have a government that is making some very ambitious commitments federally in terms of expanding protected areas. We may or may not achieve those goals, but there's a real lack of vision around nature restoration right now. I would also finally say that we need to think clearly about how nature restoration or nature protection and climate change connect within the context of nature-based climate solutions. And there's some exciting stuff going on right now around that. And then also we have to be very clear about the justice component of this, right? We have to ensure that as we move to try to support the restoration of nature or expansion of protected areas, we do it in a way that advances the reconciliation agenda. We have to make sure that Indigenous communities that are seeking support to develop Indigenous protected and conserved areas receive that support. Guardians programs to put young people in Indigenous communities to work, playing an active role in restoring habitat or overseeing and conserving and protecting the land. Those programs need to be funded. agreements need to be structured in such a way that the traditional rights, the traditional hunting and fishing rights of indigenous communities are respected, and that it actually reinforces their ability to assert control over their traditional territory. And we need to be thinking about how to make programs in the inner cities and in cities responsive to making sure that the full diversity of the Canadian population is involved in enjoying and benefiting from nature restoration.
Graham, I want to dial back to something you were talking, you mentioned earlier, which are the green stimulus packages that are happening around in other countries.
Yeah.
Can you talk about Europe and anywhere else that you think there's a model?
Yeah, I mean, it's taking off in many places around the world. We've seen most recently, just over the past few days, South Korea was the latest country to announce that a significant portion of its recovery package was going to be focused on green recovery. The European Union, championed in part by France and Germany, their most recent 800 billion stimulus package, I think 25% of that was focused on what they would consider to be green recovery initiatives. In New Zealand, a country that is providing a lot of inspiration these days, $1 billion was put into what they called nature jobs. And this is a country of about 5 million people. So that's actually, per capita, quite a significant investment in nature. And so we are seeing this happen around the world, and the kinds of investments in the clean energy transition, in the just transition, in training, and in things like nature restoration and agricultural support from an environmental perspective, removal of invasive species, tree planting. These kinds of things are unfolding around the world.
And so for the Canadian government, would you say that Canada should be looking to the European Union for guidance?
I would say that the government of Canada needs to clearly not just say, but act on the basic premise that we need a green recovery, that we are trying to both respond to the very legitimate economic concerns that the country has. We know there's a lot of people out there that are struggling. We know there are provinces and territories that are struggling. We want to be able to support those people and those communities, but we don't just want to build back to a status quo that was already deeply flawed and deeply problematic in terms of creating crises of truly global proportions. What we want to do is we want to build back better. And what I would like to see from the federal government is not just an acknowledgement of that rhetorically, and I don't mean to diminish the importance of the government clearly stating their intention to stand by their environmental objectives, but we need to go beyond that, and we need to see how it's reflected on the ground through specific kinds of strategies and investments and plans. So I would like to see them be inspired by other countries that are embracing this as one dimension of their recovery strategy and putting that forward as a critical piece. But at the end of the day, it's the action that I want to see more importantly than where they're drawing inspiration from.
That's a powerful call to action for the government. Can you elaborate on what, or can you tell us how you would define a shovel-worthy job? You mentioned shovel-ready jobs. There's a lot. What's a shovel-worthy job?
So I think what we would ultimately be trying to do is a few things at once. First of all, we would be trying to identify immediate investments that are going to put people to work in ways that are going to help solve problems, right? As opposed to just reproduce or continue in a business as usual scenario. And so those would be things that can be acted on relatively quickly, will result in employment for people. People can people are either already ready to take up those jobs or can be quickly trained to take them up, and that have and that will not exacerbate other kinds of inequalities within society. In fact, ultimately optimally would have a dimension that is directly geared towards responding to inequalities within society. So they would be conscious of Indigenous rights. They would be conscious of racism in Canada, and equitable job opportunities among men and women and other things. And as I said, at the end of the day, they would also through the work be solving other kinds of problems,
Mm-hmm.
like the environmental issues I was mentioning.
Mm-hmm. Graham, I want to ask you about the forests, Canada's forests. Referencing Barry Saxifrage's articles, he's done a couple of articles in National Observer lately. Can you talk about what you think about Barry's argument that basically all logging in Canada is now beyond what forests can reabsorb carbon-wise?
Yeah, Barry's been doing brilliant work, and I meant to say off the top that I'm a longtime subscriber to and fan of the National Observer. You guys are consistently putting forth award-winning journalism, and really reporting on things that don't get reported on nearly enough. And so it's a really important contribution you're making to the environmental community and to Canada in general. And Barry's recent work is an example of that. He's been doing a really phenomenal job of deconstructing the ways that Canada's forests have gone from being a net sink of greenhouse gas emissions to a massive net source of greenhouse gas emissions, and how the government of Canada, through what you might call some fuzzy math, has been basically shifting its assumptions about how it calculates those emissions and moving forests back into being a sink as opposed to a source of greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, it begins, if you look back at the early 1990s, and Canada's forests on the whole, even if you include logging, are absorbing more greenhouse gas emissions than they're releasing. And to put this in perspective, the boreal forest contains more carbon than all of the world's proven oil reserves combined. So the boreal forest is this incredible carbon sink. And there was a time not so long ago that Canada was clear that those forests were clearly absorbing more carbon than they were releasing. What we're seeing now is that the carbon released from forest fires has been growing. The carbon released from insect infestations has been growing. And so increasingly through that, and when I'm talking about forests here, just to be clear, I'm talking about managed forests. There's sort of two kinds of forests within Canada's greenhouse gas calculations. One is forests that are being managed, and others that are forests that are not being managed in any way. And so as a result of this, the logging, which has not been reducing its greenhouse gas emissions significantly, has the forests on the whole have turned into a massive source of greenhouse gas emissions. And so there's a real problem. Industrial logging in Canada needs to come to terms with its role in greenhouse gas emissions and the contribution Canada is making to the climate change problem. And we have to do it within a way that responds to the needs of rural communities, that recognizes that the forestry sector is not like the oil sector in the sense that in some sense it's fundamentally unsustainable, given what we know about climate change. One can imagine a certain amount of logging that actually can be managed well. But right now, it sits outside of our climate change framework, and our forests are releasing huge amounts of greenhouse gas emissions, and we need to figure out a way to address that.
That's a little known fact. I think that whole situation is pretty surprising in my mind, not what I think of when I look at a forest. Graham, you used to be with Climate Action Network working on international climate agreements and energy transition, and then you went to Ecology Ottawa and you worked on urban issues. What made you want to go to Nature Canada?
Yeah, I mean, my trajectory to some degree was starting off in Africa, working on what I would call global environmental justice issues to some degree, in terms of the role of multinational corporations in places like the Niger Delta, and the environmental challenges that they faced
Hmm.
in terms of pollution, and then going to Washington D.C. and continue to work on that stuff from a solidarity perspective. When I got back to Canada, I had, by that stage, as a result of my work in Washington, I was convinced that climate change was one of the most important issues facing the world today. And there was an urgent need to focus on the energy transition, which I was very happy to do and very proud to do with the member organizations of Climate Action Network, which, as you said, is 100 organizations across the country working together to push for action on climate change, and continues to be a very strong and effective organization. But one of the things I noticed about the Canadian environmental community or movement when I was at Climate Action Network was that the organizations tend to be very focused on, shall we say, the air campaign. It's a very kind of focused on high level research, policy, lobbying, a lot of extremely smart and effective and brilliant people doing really good work. But the grassroots movement and the attention that gets paid to the grassroots movement is not nearly there's not nearly enough attention paid to that. So when I moved to college in Ottawa, I was very interested in thinking about not just how cities are at the center of the climate change challenge when we think about 80% of Canadians living in municipal urban areas, but also how we can be better organizers within the environmental community. And then transitioning to Nature Canada was to some degree a logical extension of my lifelong love of nature. It was also, I think, a reflection of the fact that in many ways, I don't love solar panels per se. I just like what solar panels do in terms of the energy transition. I don't have a particular hatred for oil at all. I just realize that we cannot continue to burn fossil fuels at the rates we're currently burning them and address climate change. And the reason I'm concerned about reducing our dependence on fossil fuels, and the reason I like the idea of a clean energy transition, is ultimately because life on Earth is endangered. Whether you're concerned about communities overseas in the global south, or whether you're concerned about Canadian communities and the disproportionate impact of severe weather on some of the most vulnerable communities around the world and the deep injustices associated with that, or whether you're concerned about the fundamental injustice of the other 8.7 million species on the planet who did not sign up for this degree of chaos and do not deserve to be put through it. And so that was what I was doing in the first place when I was working on climate change, concerned about those justice issues. And the transition in Nature Canada just brought me a little bit closer to the ground. And it brought me a little bit closer to my fundamental belief that there's something fundamentally wrong about humanity choosing a course that we logically know is going to drive millions of species to extinction, when it's an unnecessary course and we can move in another direction.
Do you think people really, what do you think that people really can grasp that fully?
I do. And I think that, so on the one hand, I look back at movements and I see, you know, 200-year arcs, 300-year arcs, where movements begin and they make progress and then they falter and they make more progress, and there are exciting, inspirational, tragic bursts that happen around the civil rights movement or the abolitionist period or the most recent Black Lives Matter push. Same within the context of the women's movement. So, and the environmental movement. And so I don't pretend that these issues, especially issues that are as profound as how does humanity present itself to the rest of the planet in a mutually reinforcing way? How do we move from being a species that is actively disrupting the life support systems of the planet and driving species to extinction, to a species that is actually benefiting and helping to restore nature as a whole? That is a fundamentally profound shift. But at the same time, our capacity to understand global systems has changed so fundamentally over the past 50 years. When I was born, the world, humanity did not have a picture of planet Earth. So that blue marble photo that you see all the time, it didn't exist until 1972 or 73. And so we are coming to terms with our relationship to planet Earth in phenomenal ways over the past 50 years. And I believe that we are, through movements like Extinction Rebellion, through the climate change movement, through the battles around nature protection, and through our growing scientific awareness of not just the complexity and beauty and of species, but also the danger that that life support systems of the planet are in. I believe we're at a very exciting moment in human history, and that the next 20 or 30 years are really going to be looked back on as a revolutionary moment. And I think we're up for it, and I think that I think we've got a lot of work to do.
So you believe that we're going to pull through this?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in a bit of a bottleneck, right? We're at a point in population growth where, in fact, even countries like India are relatively close to replacement rate, and there aren't as many regions of the world that are currently exploding. And I believe that um, humanity can understand the idea that it is entirely unacceptable for people in this world to not be able to meet their basic needs, to not have control over their reproductive choices, and to not feel like they can ensure the well-being of their children or themselves in their retirement. And it's proven that that's all we need in order to live lives and begin to deal with population growth. Uh, I believe that humanity is coming to terms with the scale of the climate crisis. I believe that humanity is coming to terms with the state of species collapse. And we are recognizing that the sixth mass extinction is a reality. And I think that there is a moment where we can actually turn things around.
Thank you, Graham. I'm going to turn now to questions from our participants. The first one is from Mike Vassell. Mike asks, while the pandemic is running, the Alberta and Ontario governments have been rescinding environmental legislation. While the pandemic is running, the Alberta and Ontario governments have been rescinding environmental legislation. How do we make progress when governments are ignoring or opposing progress on the environment?
Yeah, organize. I don't know any other way to do it. The reality is, you asked earlier why I came to Nature Canada. Another one of the reasons that I was excited about coming to Nature Canada was just that I actually think the nature community is the largest arm of the environmental movement, because no matter what size of a community you go into, you're going to find, the local canoe and kayak club, you're going to find the trail association, you're going to find the little land trust, you're going to find the naturalists that are such a core part of the Nature Canada constituency, geeking out on birds and plants, and those organizations across the country represent an incredible resource to the environmental community, but it's not a sufficiently politicized and organized movement or community. And so I believe that the only real solution to the obstinacy of governments, to the unwillingness of governments to really put forward responses that are commensurate with the scale of the challenge, is we need to organize. We need to find our friends, identify people in our communities who care about the issues, make clear demands on all of our elected leaders, be present within electoral contexts, and be consistently engaging decision makers in order to ensure that that we get the change we need. And I don't necessarily mean, often when people think about engaging decision makers, it makes them very nervous. I don't mean we need to light the torches and grab the pitchforks and storm the constituency office. I mean that decision makers are there, politicians are there to serve us. They want to make us happy. They want to win elections. And if we are adequately organized, and if we make sure that they know what we want, and we do it clearly and forcefully, then we can make progress. And sometimes it takes the kinds of things we're seeing in the United States around the Black Lives Matter movement as well, to really wake people up, to the scale of the challenge and the urgency of action. And this is a battle that people have been fighting for hundreds of years. But we've also seen in a relatively short amount of time that the consciousness of many people around the world has been awoken in new ways as a result of the protests we've been seeing.
I want to pull out a little chunk of what you just said there, because this is the thing that comes up over and over in these conversations. You said politicians are there to serve us. Make sure they know what we want, then we can make progress. Anything else about that?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, what we need to be able to do, like, power concedes nothing without a demand. Never has and never will. The climate community is finally putting forward a set of demands that is commensurate with the scale of the challenge, right? They are basically saying that we are not tinkering around at the edges of the problem anymore. We recognize that we've already gone too far in terms of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. Our goal is to not slow down the rate of increase, it's to reverse the rise, reduce greenhouse gas emissions to effectively net zero, if not below zero emissions, and that's going to effectively require a transition in terms of phasing out fossil fuels as we know it, right? The nature community doesn't have that degree of clarity in terms of the demands that it's putting forward to government. It tends to be much more localized, almost by virtue of its characteristics, right? It's a nature community. People are very grounded in their landscapes. And we need big ideas. And we need to be organizing around big ideas, getting people involved in making sure that there are specific demands that we're expecting of our decision makers, and actively organizing other people who care about them to effectively put pressure. And you know what? We also need to say thank you. We also need to be present. We also need to celebrate the victories, because it's really easy to just be fundamentally depressed all the time. But the reality is that good things do happen, progress does get made. And while we have a long struggle, we need to find a way to celebrate the victories as we go along. As Emma Goldman would say, if I can't dance, I'm not taking part in the revolution.
Heather Murphy asks, what can we do about the logging practices in this country? My understanding is that forestry is now greater than oil and gas industry in terms of emissions.
Yeah, well, once again, it depends on how you're measuring a variety of different things. I think for the most part, oil and gas is still higher emissions than the impact of harvested wood. However, as I said earlier, if you include the damage that our forests are suffering from things like forest fires and insects, we have a massive problem when it comes to reducing releasing greenhouse gas emissions from our forests. And there is no question that the logging industry is also not only encouraging a bunch of claims and assumptions that are being embedded in the carbon accounting of Canada, which lead to, I think, false impressions about emissions from logging. But they're also encouraging a variety of very false claims about the amount of emissions associated with harvested wood products. They're basically trying to convince us that because trees grow back, it means that cutting down a tree is carbon neutral. And in fact, because we store some carbon in wood, it can actually be carbon negative. And in fact, all studies have shown that those calculations are entirely incorrect. The challenge is we want to support rural communities that often are very dependent on industrial logging. We want to encourage the logging industry to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. We do need to stop harvesting, stop logging intact forests. We continue to log intact forests, and we need to stop that. And we need to bring the logging industry into basically the climate change policy framework. Remember that the logging industry was left out of the carbon tax. So it actually doesn't have a set of incentives to actually consider its greenhouse gas emissions. And we have to reevaluate many of our assumptions. The Wildlands League has done some very interesting work recently showing that logging scars, such as roads and cutouts, don't grow back as we're currently projected. So a bunch of our assumptions there are incorrect. And ultimately, that's going to involve, I think, doing two things. It's going to involve supporting the logging industry's ability to transition towards a wider range of fibers, so that it can continue to function without needing to rely on as many trees. And they're interested in doing that. And it's also going to mean, quite frankly, confronting the power of the logging industry in our country, and the degree to which it gets a free pass on a variety of things.
Seems like so much comes down to confronting industry, which is leading us into the next question from Jan McKay. How do you see us following Roosevelt-type recovery with Ford in Ontario? He's busy dismantling all our environmental protections, quite the opposite of what Roosevelt did.
Yeah, I'm also not expecting a Rooseveltian Civilian Conservation Corps from the Trump administration. And at the same time, I think that, you know, there are scenarios, and I dare to dream, but there are scenarios where, you know, we have seen some major conservation initiatives rolled out by conservative governments historically. And I like to believe that the notion of preserving life on Earth is not an inherently partisan issue. And I would like to hope that there are opportunities for the federal government, for the province of Ontario, to do the right thing in terms of investing in a green recovery. I think it also is really going to boil down a lot to the degree to which the federal government is prepared to step up. Right, we're seeing investments of unprecedented proportions in terms of helping Canadians get through the economic situation we're in right now. We have seen that the federal government has on occasion been willing to link some of those investments to things like climate transparency. And if the federal government is prepared to channel their investments in ways that also solve environmental problems and create jobs at the same time, then hopefully provinces will be more interested in securing those resources and putting them to work than wasting them over some misguided sense of not wanting to see investments in the environment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Lois Eaton asks, what actions have you observed over the years as the most effective that volunteers can do to get governments to make decisions for the environment, for social justice, for a just future for all? Talking and planning are not enough. We need action, and we need to do what is needed to get our many levels of government moving to our safe future.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's probably a lot of good answers to that. If you're talking about building a volunteer movement, and this is probably not the right time to be doing this, but I would say knocking on doors. When I went to a college in Ottawa, one of the things we did is we said, we've got a problem in this city where environmentalists are not doing enough to engage suburbanites. And there's a lot of people in the suburbs that care about our issues, but we're not taking the time to find them. And B, we've got a problem where not enough environmentalists are doing the hard work of actually getting out and talking to people they don't already know, right? So a lot of the professional opposition organizations or the environmental organizations spend the vast majority of their time having conversations with people whose opinions they already know for good and for ill. But going out and doing the kind of work that's done on a regular basis within the context of political election campaigns, which are proven techniques in terms of engaging a constituency and asking them to do something, does not get done nearly enough. There are organizations across the country that do this, no question, but it is not. It is not a sufficient portion. It is not. It is not a sufficiently large percentage of the resource and time that the nature community and the environmental movement puts in. So, I mean, think about an issue that you think you can mobilize people around. Get out there with a petition. Get to places where people congregate. Go door to door. Right now, doing some online organizing, and begin to build a constituency of people who say they care about an issue, and then get them involved in increasingly meaningful ways. And you think about the ladder of engagement, right? There's always going to be the vast majority of people who are just going to do small actions. There's going to be a little bit more people that are prepared to do a little bit more, maybe come to an event or come to a demonstration or make a phone call. Then there's going to be a smaller number of people that are prepared to meet with a decision maker or come to a protest. Then there's going to be a smaller number of people that are prepared to be volunteer leaders. And we organize and we get people engaged at a local level to put pressure on decision makers.
Graham, what's the big idea you'd like to leave us with?
I think for me right now, I look at what the federal government is saying around nature protection, and I see them saying we're going to go over the next 10 years to protect 30% of Canada's land, water, and oceans. And right now we're at 12%. So this is a very ambitious goal. And the government should be applauded for not only setting it, but for multiple times over the past few weeks, repeating it from the Prime Minister's office to the Minister of the Environment. This is the kind of big idea that is actually commensurate with the scale of the challenge we have. And to the degree that it can be integrated with reconciliation and Indigenous rights and other justice considerations, it can be a truly transformative goal from a nature protection initiative. But what worries me is that within that strip of land where most Canadians live, within 200 kilometers of the US border, we have already gone too far. Those landscapes are already too degraded. Endangered species are already too prevalent. Ecosystems have already been fundamentally compromised. And we don't in Canada have a vision for restoring those landscapes so that we can reverse the species decline and begin to restore life's abundance on Earth. And I'm not talking about driving all the people out. I'm talking about making the kinds of investments that can allow us to create the conditions for life on Earth, species, whether it's trees, shrubs, insects, and invertebrates and animals and birds of all kinds, can coexist with human populations. And so we really need to be thinking, we have to stop thinking about how do we slow the rate of destruction in our southern landscapes? And we have to start thinking about how do we demand that those landscapes be restored. And if we can put forward that kind of demand, and if we can sketch it out and begin to actually make progress across a variety of different landscapes, we can begin to lay the conditions for a world in which humanity does actually coexist with the natural world in a mutually reinforcing way, as opposed to a scenario where 1 million species are gravitating towards extinction.
Graham, thank you so much. I cannot let you go without asking how people can be in touch with you and be in touch with Nature Canada. If those of you who are participating today in this call want to be in touch with Nature Canada.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, there's hundreds of nature groups across the country that you can get involved with at a local level. And I encourage you to seek them out and get involved. Nature Canada is the national voice, focused mainly on the federal level for the naturalist community and nature community. And we are, but we really encourage you to get involved at the local level as well. But secondly, Nature Canada needs your help. All of the kinds of campaigns that we're working on in terms of nature-based climate solutions, expanding protected areas, the green recovery, restoration, connecting kids and families to nearby nature, all of these initiatives require resources, and they require people to be part of the conversation and join the conversation. So if you are not already subscribed to Nature Canada's newsletter, which is how we keep in touch with you, you can go to our website, naturecanada.ca, and subscribe. And I would be entirely remiss if I didn't point out the obvious idea that Nature Canada needs your financial support as well. And donations to Nature Canada are greatly appreciated and will be put towards defending, discovering, and restoring nature in this beautiful country.
And so I really encourage you to do that, all of you. And I know I'll be going and taking a look and seeing what you're doing over there, Graham. And if you haven't already, I'm going to, underscore that by saying, please subscribe to Canada's National Observer. We are dedicated to keeping climate change and the environment at the center of the national conversation and empowering you with information about that on a day-to-day basis. So please subscribe. And Graham, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone on the call. I want to thank Francesca Fionda for producing this, and Jenny Uechi and Janelle Johnson for their support. Stay well, everyone, and have a great night.
And thanks to the National Observer.